the Unitarian Universalist Church of Worcester podcast. We are a community built on love, hope, and justice. Our goal is to inspire people to take on the challenges of a changing world. Each week we'll bring you a reflection from our minister, the Reverend Aaron Payson, recorded during our Sunday service. Maybe it'll move you, challenge your thinking, or even stir up a little righteous indignation. That's all welcome here. Thanks for listening.
UUCW is pleased to welcome Dr. Stephen Ledoux this morning as our guest speaker. Dr. Ledoux is Emeritus Professor of Behaviorology from the State University of New York in Canton, New York. His reflection this morning is, can a science flood story inspire us as much as the one by Noah? Or, how long can you tread water?
Most likely, we are all familiar with biblical stories, like Noah building a boat and stuffing it with two of every kind of living thing to escape the flood caused by a supposed global deluge. We were all raised on this story and likely inspired by it. We may even be better persons due to some of the lessons in it. Stories on many topics in most cultures were all humanity had for millennia. Today, however, we also have science. And can science provide similar stories with similar effects, make us better persons, inspire us? My bias suggests a yes answer. Perhaps a closer look at the flood story as told by science discoveries will be revealing. Noah's story, of course, is not the only flood story. Many ancient cultures have supplied history with similar flood stories. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh. These stories seem to have originated around the same time from cultures that share a large but limited geographic range a few thousand miles across, centered on Anatolia, more recently known as Turkey. So, what happened? Did holy scribes in several cultures all get told by their local god at about the same time to write down a lesson-filled flood story? Or did something really happen? Something of such seriousness that it prompted continuous retelling, first orally, and then possibly a millennium or more later in written forms. Historians know that oral traditions can last even longer than this, with compelling accuracy. The written versions usually contain some added layers of lessons. But what could have happened? What natural, though catastrophic, events could predictably have had that kind of effect on people, prompting such continuous retelling in the terms of the times about a god or gods punishing the taboo activities of some people in those cultures by wiping out the world in a great deluge and flood? Now, maybe Noah's flood story occurred just as he tells it. Or maybe it is but one mystical story among many with moral lessons. Yet in 1999, a science magazine author's brief book review in a letter caught my eye. It discussed a book titled Noah's Flood, the new scientific discoveries about the event that changed history. In this book, the authors, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, reported their multidisciplinary research results as leaving little doubt that something really did happen, and that this science flood story helps many otherwise seemingly unrelated puzzle pieces fit together into a meaningful whole. For years, however, other ongoing life events, such as writing natural science of behavior books, kept me distracted from this fascinating topic. And there matters stood until a letter and response in the July-August 2023 issue of another periodical, Skeptical Inquirer. That inspired renewed interest. The discussants in that issue seemed quite unaware of the discoveries reported in Ryan and Pittman's book. Why? Were there substantive, science-grounded concerns, objections, criticisms to their work? My subsequent search failed to turn up any that seemed decisively compelling. Your search may vary, but my search did turn up a lot of unhelpful, though predictable, pushback from people compelled to prefer a literal Bible reading. So, what's all the fuss about? Our Western cultural traditions, along with others, have appreciated several versions of the Great Flood story for millennia. And in the past couple hundred years, the increasing appreciation of science and its improved methods for collecting hard data has also increased interest in what such data might tell us about stories like the Great Flood. Can data satisfy our curiosity? Can data answer our questions about what really happened, to whom, where, when, and why? Indeed, the mere possibility of some solid scientific answers about this well-known story is itself inspiring, although perhaps not in just the traditional ways. We cannot here cover everything in Ryan and Pittman's book and what their hundreds of colleagues discovered. For that, do read the book. But we can cover a few of their main points and perhaps through them paint a picture of what science has begun to tell us about the Great Flood, what really happened, to whom, where, when, and why. Originally, relevant data began to accumulate from diverse times and places and people. It gradually piled up like loose puzzle pieces in a box. But only late in the process did anyone begin to see the connections between these puzzle pieces and the Great Flood story. By a dozen points, here are some puzzle pieces that piled up. Point 1, the discovery of unknown ancient writings in different languages and their initial translation showed some close interrelations among them. These interrelations suggested some kind of language diaspora. Point 2, geology had already shown that big floods do happen. For example, 5 million years ago, before any humans were around, the Mediterranean basin had been empty for some time. And then the Gibraltar land barrier broke, unleashing a flood that would make Noah's great flood seem wimpy. Today, the salty Black Sea, in its over 6,000 foot deep basin, is level with the Mediterranean Sea. From before 8,000 BCE, however, and for at least a couple thousand years, the basin contained only a slowly drying out and shrinking freshwater lake. By about 2000 BCE, this lake had a level some 550 feet lower than today's Mediterranean Sea, because at this time the Bosphorus was not open to the basin. Point 4, sonar data show that the now submerged ancient Stone Age deltas of some of the rivers that flow into the Black Sea basin. Back then, they flowed into the lower, smaller freshwater lake. Indeed, the sonar data indicate the lowest shoreline of the ancient shrunken lake to be about 550 feet below the level of today's Black Sea, revealing hundreds of miles of gently sloping land surface that now remain underwater. Point 5, fossils in the core samples from under the Black Sea show that the transition from fresh water to salty water happened quickly on human time scales. Some cores also showed the presence of dry mud flats just under those fossils, and other cores showed sand dunes that had not been altered by any gradual rise in the level of the nearby lake, but had instead been quickly inundated. Point 6, dating of the core parts from the time just before the saltwater invasion gives an age of some 7,600 years ago, which is about 5,600 BCE. Around this time, the pressure of water that had been building in the Mediterranean Sea as its level rose hundreds of feet due to end of Ice Age melting, broke through the Bosphorus land dam and began dumping Mediterranean Sea salt water into the then somewhat empty Black Sea basin and its ancient freshwater lake. Point 7, by the time of this saltwater invasion, farming had already been practiced in neighboring Anatolia and Greece for over 1,000 years. Sadly, present science budgets cannot afford searches under the current waters of the Black Sea Basin for archaeological evidence of farming. Point 9, still the presence of farming around the freshwater lake shoreline makes an appropriate presumption. The farming communities around the ancient lake would have substantive investments in their homeland. Expulsion by a permanent flood would have been close to annihilation. Point 9, from the input of the rivers that empty into the basin, if the water in the lake had risen gradually at the rate the oceans rose after glacial ice caps started melting, the fastest rate would never have exceeded 6 feet a century, which is about 1/500th of an inch a day. You can check my math. The dating, however, of the evidence from numerous core samples and from the discovered size and height of the later Bosphorus opening show that the lake level rose at a much faster rate. It rose at the rate of 6 inches per day. Given the shallow slope of the basin's sides, a 6-inch rise in water level per day would each day cover another mile of dry land with water. Point 10, the usual response of hunters and gatherers to floods is simply to move on. Such floods and movements were common enough and no big deal in the hunter-gatherer experience. An exodus, however, would have had the power to build myth, as farmers and herders would have had to take their seed and animals with them for survival. Point 11, the sonar data showed that on the wide shelf of the ancient lake, west of the Crimea, the dry land around the lake angled up at no more than 2 feet per mile. Someone escaping the onslaught of the rising tide on this shelf would have had to travel on the average a quarter mile per day to keep up with the inundation. If fleeing up the very flat river valleys, they would have had to move half a mile to a mile per day, every day, day after day, for more than the traditional 40 days, more likely for 100 to 200 days, to cover enough ground to stay out of the rising water. And all these days, they would have needed to worry about and carry all that they could carry. Certainly, this was a unique and scary months-long trek that would not soon be forgotten. And so began the multi-direction migration of peoples and practices away from the rising sea and into the facts and legends of history. Indeed, the oral traditions of many cultures in this widening geographic area retold this story, with many different culture-derived and culture-supporting embellishments, such as king lists and religious morals and biases. These embellished stories come down to us today from when the oral traditions were finally written in stone, literally, on clay tablets, and later on papyrus and vellum and paper, as the stories of the likes of Gilgamesh and Noah. After assembling the data that answered questions about a location, the Black Sea, a date, 5,600 BCE, a calculation of the magnitude of the flood, 6 inches per day, the time available to escape, rising waters for a year or two, and the distances to be covered in escaping, hundreds of miles, many questions remained. Who might have witnessed the flood and formed the subsequent migration away from the rising waters? What languages did they speak? Where did they go and settle? Numerous strands of evidence document that around this time, in the wake of the Black Sea flood, several peoples appeared as if out of nowhere to the west and northwest of the Black Sea basin, as well as to its northeast and southeast. These were farming peoples settling on unoccupied land or on previously occupied land, as well as land occupied by hunter-gatherers whom they displaced. All but one of these groups strictly avoided living anywhere near any ocean coastlines, as if they had been chased upstream by a flood and still worried that the fountains of the deep would spring forth again. The areas where the new peoples from the flood diaspora appeared quickly included not only parts of Europe and southern Russia, but also Anatolia, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, and indeed the whole Fertile Crescent. So the cradle from which Western civilization actually sprang seems really to have been the flooded rim of the Black Sea Basin's old freshwater lake. The data even strongly suggests that the flood-caused diaspora began not only the foundational branching of the daughter languages of Proto-Indo-European, but also a similarly timed branching of the human genetic tree. This real and horrifying flood experience thus remained alive in its continual and increasingly multilingual retelling, across numerous cultures from Europe to India, from Russia to Africa, and on into today's world. In our own time, beyond the well-researched preservative techniques of epic storytelling, natural science has added analyses of the preservative documentation in the kinds of texts recorded in layers of mud, sand, and gravel from the bottom of lakes and seas, using the tools and principles of physics, chemistry, and biology. The scientific plot can then be given richer details and new themes from the supporting contributions of the archaeologist, the linguist, the geneticist. The discoveries that produced all these points were originally unrelated, occurring a piece here, a bit there. Any interconnections initially went unrecognized. Little by little, however, researchers began to connect the dots. Patterns and sequences of facts and dates began to stand out. The big picture began to emerge. So far, though, like those discoveries, my presentation of these points necessarily comes out a bit disjointed. Now, however, we can put them together and paint that big picture as a new great flood story, a science flood story for today's world. Today, the top 50 feet of the Bosphorus flows south, out of the Black Sea. Meanwhile, the rest of the Bosphorus waters, the salty bottom current below 50 feet, flows north into the Black Sea, a last vestige of the Great Flood that happened in 5600 BCE, or 7,625 years ago. Below the river sediments, the channel of the Bosphorus, cut by the flood's inflow, bottoms out at 400 feet deep, about 100 feet above the level of the shrunken Ice Age Black Sea Lake. Initially, the floodwater through the gap may have started as just a trickle, a small stream. Within days, however, it would have washed through the loose soils and gravels, gaining power first as a brook, then as an ever-growing river, swiftly and forcefully scouring and gouging out its bottom and sides deeper and wider. Within days, it became a turbulent river with the torrent of a maelstrom. Within days, it became a thundering fume, twisting and churning with rubble and debris, cutting deeper and spreading faster as it poured out 10 cubic miles of water every day, enough to cover Manhattan Island each day to a depth of half a mile. For around 2 years, mostly after the human population had fled, the floodwaters continued to climb up the shallow sides of the Black Sea basin, perhaps with less violence in the second year. The waters finally filled the basin to the present Black Sea level, the level of the Bosphorus and the Mediterranean, over 500 feet above the level of the ancient Black Sea Lake. Where the swollen Mediterranean when the swollen Mediterranean waters had finally broken through the Bosphorus land dam, the flood flowed in with the volume of 200 Niagaras and quickly began raising the lake level by those 6 inches per day, covering another mile-wide swath of previously dry land all around the rising shoreline. The Bosphorus flume roared and surged at full speed for at least 300 days. The waters roared through the Bosphorus Strait at speeds greater than 50 miles per hour, crashing through unabated, radiating a thunderous din and vibration that could possibly be felt and heard around the entire rim of the Black Sea, a shoreline that hosted and supported numerous communities, people that must now get out of the way. The beginning of that din was the last of various warning signs, but one still had time to flee. And would the low-pitched rumbling terror sound like the warning voice of a powerful deity, supposedly ticked off by some human iniquities, telling of a permanent flood and that it's time to move away? And move away people did, moving daily to higher and higher ground, mile after terrible, tortured mile, all to escape from what? Such incredible violence and continuous violence may only have been understandable to people at that time as nothing short of the collective fury of all their gods, whom they must have somehow displeased. With all this water and flooding, who needs fire and brimstone? All those experiences got indelibly planted in the survivors' oral and later written history. And for those whose migration led them to Mesopotamia, where some of the great flood stories continued, their oral histories were regularly dramatized and reinforced by the usual floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, reminding them of the big one from which they got away. And that was how they told their story to all their descendant generations and cultures, each with its particular slant and variation of the flood escape theme, retold in and beyond the original diaspora, retold for us as the Noah story, retold until today with a new story version emerging from that human activity known as science, with new and appropriate lessons for human behavior and how we treat each other and our world and everything in it. So now we have a different kind of story about the same ancient flood. Beyond the incontestable emotional reactions that we have to such horrendous legendary events, both then and now, today we have some incontestable scientific facts about the same historical event. Behind the many flood stories, with at least as many lessons to help us move through today's world and on into tomorrow's world. That ancient flood forced a diaspora of people and cultures. Their movements and the stories they left us have, over the past 7 millennia, indeed changed the course of human history. And today's scientific story about the flood can and must similarly change the course of today's history and on into the future. Please, let that inspire you.
Thanks for tuning in. If you're just crossing our path, either new to this congregation or curious about Unitarian Universalism, check out our website, uucworcester.org. You'll find lots of information there about our beliefs, the 8 guiding principles, religious exploration for children and adults, our social action initiatives, and the many groups we offer to help people connect and have fun. And consider joining us in person or online on a Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We'd love to meet you.